Yep, that's on.
Okay. Yeah, well, hello. Thank you for joining me on my musings on China. Today we've got Robyn Schroder, a wonderful lady who lived in China for 9 years and was there when I was, and also features in China Blonde, my memoir, coming out. So you need to keep an eye out for her there and all her wisdom and insight. Now, my aim with these chats is to really give people who've perhaps never been to China or only been to those first-tier cities like Shanghai or Beijing, a better insight, I guess, into what China is really like. And of course, at the moment, with everything that's going on with COVID-19, I guess China is on people's radar like never, ever before, for both good and bad reasons at the moment. So we'll get into it. Good morning, Robyn. Thanks for joining us from Perth.
Hi, Nicole. My pleasure.
It's good to see you again after, I don't know, a few years, isn't it?
A few years, yeah. It sure is.
Now,
you haven't changed
just come back. Thanks. So you've just come back from living in China for almost a decade. You came back in the middle of this pandemic, and things weren't quite where they are now in Australia. How's the adjustment going for you? Big question.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I've come back and things haven't been normal. Normally you'd expect to be running around and catching up with family and friends, and that's just not been the case. And because we're in a lockdown, so we're restricted, I found, you know what, I actually think it makes it easier. So it just makes it's not so much pressure, it's not so intense. So
yeah, that's a good point.
It is strange. It is strange, but it's strange for everybody right now. So,
I think you're right.
Yeah, and because we're in a lockdown there, I couldn't say goodbye to my friends or anything. So I had been over there in lockdown. I had been on my own, in my own apartment, whereas here I'm with family. So, all very weird times.
Yeah. Look, I think you're right when you say, because repatriating is always a whirlwind. I just thought back then to coming back and everyone wants to see you all at once after a decade away, and it's pretty overwhelming. So this is probably a good way to ease into it. Yeah.
Well, you know, yeah. I think it's actually made it softer. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. And so let's talk about what took you to China in the first place. You'd been before, I know that. Tell us about your journey. How did you end up being one of those people that makes China home for so long?
I was born in 1960, so I was a teenager in the 70s, and China would show up in the news sometimes, and the tiny bit of footage that came out and the news that came out was such a fascinating place, and it was closed. The idea that you could close the door on a country and say no one's allowed in. And I'm an Australian. Don't tell me I can't do something, you know. So it interested me. And I'd read some stories of missionaries who'd been there, you know, in the past. And then I went there in 1989, and oh my goodness, I felt like if I was on a foreign planet, it couldn't be more alien, more different to Australia. It's just fascinating. And
tell me what that was like. What was that like when in 1989? I mean, you know, that is only 30 years ago, which doesn't seem that long ago, and things were pretty developed and civilized, and, you know, that's when we first moved to Australia. What was it like stepping off the plane? Where did you go? To Xi'an or to another city?
No, we flew into Hong Kong. We got a ferry into Guangzhou, train up to Shanghai, and then flew to Beijing. And it was so fascinating because that was October of 89, so only a few months after the Tiananmen incident. So it was really fascinating to see how the closer you got to Beijing, the more the more you could feel the oppression, the more you could feel almost, it was very palatable almost, the fact that people were uptight and the tension. So Beijing was interesting in that. As far as development goes, my goodness, I never would have believed that a country could develop so quickly. Beijing in 1989, the only vehicles that everyone was using was bicycles. There were government buses and a bit of government transport. That was all. So, this time, since then, I think it was 2004, I was right out in Xinjiang, and that was even more advanced out there, I was in Urumqi and Kabul, and not Kabul, Kashgar, and it was more advanced there. So it's just
and I think that's what's so hard for people today to understand, because even when we went to Xi'an, there were so many bicycles on the streets, and over those few years there were more and more and more cars each day, and it's hard for people to realize that it's only been the last decade or 20 years that they've really had cars on the road as the main mode of transport.
Less than a generation. So the foreigners we will sometimes find it really hard the way they drive, but we forget that we grew up with our parents driving us around. They didn't. They grew up with bicycles or walking. And so a lot of them, the younger drivers in China are actually better than the older ones. And a lot of the way the older ones drive is just the way they used to ride a bicycle. Makes things interesting, hey, Nicole? I mean, you'd know.
Does. Yeah. Wasn't game to get in the car over there. So you went in 1989. You didn't stay though, but something in you had changed. You'd seen something and you wanted more. Is that right?
Yeah. Look, it was just so different, and I guess, that's it. Well, before then, I had thought, I like reading books about missionaries that are 100 years before, and hearing about the needs there, especially for orphans and things like that. It made me really want to go and help. Now, there's plenty of countries in the world where people need help, but the thing with China is it's difficult. Because it's a communist country, they take care of their people, and they don't want outside help. They'll say the government provides for everybody, and they don't want outside help. So whereas there's lots of Australians helping in places like, Cambodia and Thailand and places like that, that's fine. But in China, there's this added difficulty of having to do it as quietly and as much in the background as you can. So
I think people are starting to get a taste of that, aren't they? At the moment, they're getting a taste of what that is like with coronavirus, and getting the facts out of there and things like that. They're seeing that China very much gathers around its own, and it's a very tight country. It's hard to get anything out of them.
I think we all do that. I think we all, as Australians, we can have a go at our government, we can have a go at the way we do things, but we don't want other people to. And the Chinese government have much more they've got control of the media, but I would ask the question, who has control of our media? We all, it's all, somebody has control of it.
About this, and we have talked about this before when we were interviewing. I interviewed Robyn for the book, but we're not going to get too political today, because there's plenty of people out there doing that, aren't they? They're doing that for us. So cast your mind back when you actually did return to China. Was it Xi'an that you moved to, and was it to help out with the orphanages?
Yeah, well, when I first went there, I moved I went to Xi'an because I was told if you want to learn Chinese, that's the best place to go. You don't want to go to Shanghai because they don't speak it there. Their language they speak is Shanghaiese. You don't want to go to Beijing because not only is it very expensive, but you end up with the Beijing accent, which has negative connotations if you want to move out west. So Xi'an is sort of like on what the Chinese think of as the edge of the civilized world, and they have, it's a big university city, so a lot of minority students come in there, and so the accent you pick up by learning the language there is very acceptable, and it also gives you exposure to minorities, which I was really interested in. You know, if you're going somewhere and want to experience the culture and embrace the culture and have experiences, Xi'an's the place to go. Yeah. And it turned out to be right. Yeah.
And it's just so different to those cities like Shanghai and Beijing, isn't it? I mean, it's still,
absolutely.
I've said this a million times, but there might be 9 million people there. And on the surface, it is quite civilized, but how would you explain it as being so different? It's hard to put your finger on it.
It sure is. It's more like a big country town. It's definitely more rural. They're trying to be sophisticated, but it's got a strong influence from minorities. So, yeah.
When you say minorities, just for the people listening, who are you meaning?
I'm meaning, so the vast majority of Chinese people are Han Chinese. But there's a lot of people who have a different cultural background. So if China was divided up into cultural differences, there would be hundreds of people who live there. So the Han Chinese is the majority, and then the next is the Hui, and they are Muslim. And there's a lot of the minority groups are Muslim. There's some that are Buddhist, and they all have their own traditions, their own costumes, their own culture, and it's really interesting. Like a very familiar one for most people would be Tibetans. They are Chinese because they're in China, but we all understand that they look different. And they have a completely different culture, completely different language.
Absolutely. So tell us what it was like when you arrived in Xi'an to live then.
Well, when I got there,
that
was 2011, February 2011. So it was it was still during the winter break, bad time to go. If ever you're shifting to a country, don't go there, you know, in the winter when everyone's away on holidays. Well, for them it was winter, so I didn't know anyone there, but I did have contact details of a friend of a friend. I find in Xi'an it doesn't take long to make friends. My first week there was hard. You know, you can't speak the language and you need to eat. You can't even go to the shop and buy milk because milk doesn't come in the same packaging as we have it here or the same form. You know, everything is so different. So it is a bit, you know, rough. Fortunately, I'd been to China before for a couple of short trips. But I think if you're planning to go to another country and live for a long time, it's certainly helpful if you go have a look first.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I said to you I'd been there, but not to Xi'an. And, you know, I'd lived in Hong Kong and thought, you know, I knew what China was, and I really got a big dose of culture shock.
You would have, because Hong Kong is where we go for a break from China, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the other thing. I think a lot of people think, oh, Hong Kong mustn't be so different to China. They find, you know, because obviously it's technically part of China and it's you know, it's on that mainland, a lot of people find it really difficult to understand how different Hong Kong is to China as well.
Yeah, it is. It's completely different. Yeah.
It's another world, isn't it?
The culture, the way of thinking. If you're in Hong Kong, you can often spot the mainland Chinese. They're just so different. Yeah.
Yeah, they stand out for sure. So tell me what it was like, what you've learnt the language. I've heard you speak. You're pretty good.
No, I'm not, but that's okay. I've learnt enough Chinese to get me into trouble.
Or out.
Well, mainly into trouble. One time I was talking to a taxi driver and he wasn't responding the way I expected him to. And instead of saying something about, I was divorced and something about my ex-husband, I had said something about a lover. And so he was very keen to offer his services. Oh my goodness.
I bet.
So, yeah.
Lost in translation.
It was hilarious. It was so funny. Yeah.
So of all the people that I met in China, you have to be, I think, one of those people who has managed to embrace China and really become a part of the community, because it is easy when you go there often as an expat to stick with expat friends because it feels it's more what you know, and because of that language barrier. And that's the same with a lot of countries. But you really immersed yourself into the Chinese culture. And they love you. They absolutely adore you. You had your English corner every week when you'd have a cafe full of foreigners coming to talk with Chinese people. You did your swimming teaching, you did all sorts. And they really looked up to you. What do you think it was that allowed you to really fit into that culture?
I think it's easy as a foreigner to get them to embrace you, because, as you know, they're curious, they're interested. They tend to treat us a bit like TV stars, especially ones who haven't seen foreigners before, and they'll tend to be really interested. But for you to become part of their lives and to embrace it yourself, you really need to make a point of making Chinese friends, to socialise with them. And it was really important to try and understand why things are the way they are. As you know, it can be so frustrating. Things that are just done for us, they just don't understand. And if you can find out why things are the way they are, it makes life so much easier. So, and I was there for 9 years. After 8 years, one of my friends explained something to me and I thought, oh. So I think don't compare. It's so unfair to say that China's so far behind and they don't provide for the poor as well as we do, and they don't provide education as well as we do. But when we were at the same stage of development as they are, we weren't doing those things either. And I do think it's important to remember that.
And I think that's a huge thing, you saying that. And that's really, with my book, what I started out writing was to try and understand why they are the way they are, and humanize them a little bit more to the rest of the world. And I think you can't compare, and you have to remember that while they look like this extremely developed country on the surface, their economy, is the second biggest in the world, effectively, they're still very much a developing country.
Yeah, and they've come a long way in such a short time. I've often heard it said that no other civilization in the history of mankind has ever moved and progressed as fast as China has. So, and I mean, even in the short time that you and I were there, you see the changes, and it happens so quickly. It just shows you we humans are so adaptable. You know, you can go away and come back after a couple of months, and there'll be, you know, things have changed so much in maybe the way you pay your bills or something. It's really quite amazing. Yeah.
Which I think is why, you know, the world watched on in awe as Wuhan built that incredible outdoor hospital so quickly. It was like, how the heck are they going to do that? Whereas I think
they would have already had the plans and they would have already had it set up to go, which is another thing. They would have planned ahead for that. They would have planned ahead. They would have already had all the prefab done, not necessarily for that spot, but because it's a big government and a big country and they've got the money, they can set up beforehand for that, so that when they need it, bang, 10 days, it's there. That's amazing.
Yeah. And I think that's sometimes hard for people to comprehend when things for us in the West can take so long to happen. And, you know, as you say, a lot of the people that are in Xi'an or any of these, you know, there's 600 and something cities with over a million people. They've come straight from, you know, villages and farms, and many of them have not crossed a road using the little, you know.
Look, absolutely. I visited a few friends in the villages where they came from, and I think particularly of my friend, her English name is Olivia, was a manager of a few cafes. I don't know if you met her, but she grew up in a tiny village, and her home, the kitchen floor was dirt. You know, and quite a lot of them, the homes they grew up, don't have floors. It's dirt floors. The toilet each house might not have its own toilet. It'll be a hole dug with a metre-high wall around that everybody in the village uses. And then they come into the city and there's all these requirements that they don't understand, you know. And I think it does help to remember where they've come from.
And that's happening right now, isn't it? I mean, it's 2020, and lots of Chinese friends of yours and people we know have their parents living back in these types of villages that aren't that far away. Yeah,
and it's really these two lives they have. It's no wonder.
Like a parallel world, isn't it? Like you've got the rich with the Ferraris and the money, and then, you know, it's so on display there.
Well, it's not only that, is that they're rich are all new rich. And so they're really keen to show it off, but they don't necessarily remember they've probably come from that background I just talked about. One of the first places I went was a village up on the Tibetan plateau. I was staying with a young friend I hadn't made. His parents, now it's a very basic village. They had, you know, they had a well they had to draw the water from. They had communal toilet. Now, his family would have been one of the wealthiest ones in town. In fact, he would be wealthy. They would be wealthy by our standards. If they came to live in Australia, they would be able to live in a good part of town, in a good house. So it took me a while to realise that, but he's travelled all over the world, and he has come from, his mum and dad were herders, you know, and so they lived in tents and moved from place to place, and now they live in a house which is quite a big one, but they actually still only tend to live in a one room with a fire in the centre of the room. And although they have nice clothes and the latest phones, they still use the toilet that everybody else in their village has to use. And they have a tap to their own well, but other people come in to use their well. So they don't although they've got lots of money, they don't think to spend it on the same things that we would. It's really interesting. So,
it is, isn't it?
yeah.
It's fascinating, really fascinating.
Yeah, we would, that's why I sort of went there, and it took me time to realise they've made a lot of their money from their, what are they called? Those worm things they collect on the side of the Tibetan plateau. I forget what it's called now, but yeah. Anyway,
so that gives you an indication of what we're talking about, I think, and why you know, our Westerners just see them kind of pushing in lines and shoving and talking loudly. Not long ago, I was in a Sydney train station, and I was going to some concert and with a friend, and we saw a Chinese lady with her little boy, and she was yelling at him, and really he was in trouble. And you know, that's just what happens. But my friend was about to go over there, and you know, I'm like, just leave it. This is normal.
That's
you know,
fine.
so it's normal to speak with, you know, raised voices, and you know.
Yeah, you'll think there's a brawl going on outside, and it turns out they're just having a great old time. They've
just
seen
having
an
a
old
conversation.
Friend. Yeah, I think that is, though, for our part of China. I don't think it's like that for all of China.
No.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, interesting. So also another thing I wanted to touch on is that what they think of us in the West. Because while we feel like a lot of them are travelling, and a lot of them are travelling, you know, when it's a country of 1.4 billion people, only 10% still have a passport. So there's still a lot more travelling to be done and exploring by the Chinese people of the West. A lot of them really have no idea about the West, apart from what they may see in the movies or on TV. Which is probably why they're so fascinated. But they also wouldn't know, for example, I think at the moment with coronavirus and what's going on outside of China and what people are saying and demanding and expecting, I think they would have no idea, apart from obviously the government, the party and, you know, those elites.
Yeah.
The general average person on the street would not be informed.
I think the young people, uni students and younger, or the 30 and younger, are far more aware. But people my generation, so born in the 50s, 60s, they are just, really unaware. For example, I went with a Korean friend to visit my Chinese friend in her village. Now, they lived very small village, and her mother was saying that, okay, you know, that they were preparing for my friend and I, my South Korean friend and I, to go and visit. And so Olivia was discussing it with her mum, and she showed her mum a picture of me, who her mother had met before. Oh yes, I know her. And showed her a picture of Xi'an. And her mother said, but you said she's a foreigner. And Olivia said, yes, she is. And she said, but she looks just like us. She didn't know that there were Chinese or Asian looking people outside of China. So that shows you the extent to which they are completely unaware. And Olivia has since got married and is now, for now, she's living back near home. And if anyone is interested to know anything about what's happening in the outside world or with the foreigners, they ask her, because she has foreign friends, and she's actually travelled to Australia. She came with me one time. So she therefore is an expert on anything foreign as far as they're concerned. It's very funny.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? That you know, and I think that's a thing that a lot of people outside of China or who haven't been there just don't understand, that they're not really thinking about the West all the time, and you know, there's not this big sort of he said, she said.
That's
going
right.
on.
Yeah. We have so much more access to information than than they have. So we know far more about China than they know about us. And yeah.
And they also
So
don't
curious.
really mind, do they? You know, I've asked a lot of them about censorship, which obviously happens. But most local people will say, what censorship? You know, we're fine with it. It doesn't bother us. Except, of course, as you say, those younger generations coming up and the uni students that are really starting to get onto other social platforms.
Yeah.
But, you know, the 35, 40 upwards, you know, it's always been survival of the fittest in China. So really...
Well, yeah. I find that even the young ones, although they're more aware of it, so it seems they all know, they just get told what the government tells them. But they don't seem to mind. You're right. They sort of, they don't mind that. The young ones who mind tend to be the ones who are influenced by Americans they've met. So because I think it's a very strongly, freedom of speech is very important in the American culture, and I've heard Americans spouting off about it. They, as a foreigner in China, you can really be a strong influence because they really take what we have to say on board. So you need to be really careful about not, I find, about not wanting to impose ideas that there's nothing they can do about. I mean, there's no point if you only tell them all the good things about your country but don't tell them the downfalls. It just makes them feel bad about where they are, and you know, I don't think that is helpful. But yeah, I've lost track of where I was going with that.
National, that's all right. No, it's interesting that you know, the pride that they have in their country is really unparalleled, I think. You know, just whether it's, and I said this in my last interview, whether it's ingrained in them or, you know, they're brought up to have that, it's there, isn't it? There's just no denying that they are a country, and even in these times, they'll be sticking together as a nation, very proud of what they've done to achieve results and things like that.
Patriotism is strong. I do think they have a right to be proud because they have achieved a lot. And it is certainly ingrained in them. It's certainly taught to them from a very early age. In two of the places where I lived, I had views into a primary school backyard, and it's just, ingrained in them. But there's also until more recently, until the current chairman came into leadership, they were more open about speaking about their dissatisfaction with things, and the older people as well. I think sometimes that the people you met and the people I met would be quite a different demographic. So once, I found that there was some unrest, and there were sometimes things going on that people weren't happy about, but that all stopped quite suddenly when Xi Jinping changed things.
Wow, you can,
so now they're just, it's wonderful.
So what are you missing the most now that you're back here? Obviously the people, but I mean, life is just so different in Australia.
Oh, my life, it's so different now. I'm with family, and I miss being useful, and I'm concerned for the work that's not being done now. There are orphans and special needs kids that without certain people being allowed to go in there and help, there
What's the situation now with orphanages? Are there still a lot of orphanages in China?
Yes, there are, and the situation can change quite a lot. And I sort of can't talk about it too much. It's been recorded, but things more recently, in the last year or two, have gotten worse as far as the care has gone. So stories I told you about what happened in the past, you know, when back in Xi'an, when we were together and talking, things have sort of gone backwards from our perspective. So there are still kids, still special needs kids, and there are still orphans. All the orphans now, though, there's something wrong with them. Nobody abandons a healthy child.
Is it generally, I remember it was often the cleft palate was the situation.
Yeah. Cleft palate, hole in the heart, all sorts of things. Any deformity, maybe a hand, and it'll tend to come in waves. Like we had at one stage, gosh, that was before I got there, about 14 years ago, there was a wave of kids who were coming with a deformed ears and things wrong with their hearing. And then in another area, there'll be kids with digits missing or deformed hands or cleft palates, or it tends to go in waves. So
it's sad, isn't it? There's still that element happening.
Well, they don't have, we've got to be careful not to judge, because if we have a child born or a child who has something wrong with them, we get a lot of help from the government, not only for the child but for the family. We get a lot of help there. If you have a child born that's going to take a lot of money to look after and care for, then it's not only on you and your husband but on the extended family. And you know, they could all go financially down the tube. So a lot of people will give, you can tell if a child's been loved before it was given up for, before it was abandoned. Like if a child is brand new and just left in a box at a train station or then it's probably that they don't care. But if a child's a little bit older, wrapped up, kept warm, we've put with a bit of food or formula and put inside the hospital or inside the train station, then you know that there's a family there that are heartbroken and they're giving it up because they've got no choice. Yeah.
Tough.
Well, I can't imagine.
No, me neither. Well, I mean, we're just touching the surface today, but I think we can come back and do another one of these, hopefully, if you're able to, and you know, talk about in more detail about a lot of these things. There's so many topics, and that was a hard thing writing the book as well, just trying to
choosing.
weave
I know,
topics with life and all of that. Do you think you'll go back to China? Is that the plan, or no?
Not long term now, no. It's just too hard with the visa situation, and now I want to be here with my family now. So you know, I was there for a long time, but being there meant I missed out on a lot with my kids here. I say kids, you know, they're your age, but
I know what you mean, though. Yeah.
So I'd really love to go back after the middle of the year, like when we can, because Olivia will have had a baby, and I've got other things that I'd like to tidy up and finish up. I didn't get to say goodbye to people. There are projects and things that we were doing. I'd like to go back for a while and see if I can get them up and running again once the foreigners are allowed back in. It's like we had, like the swimming. We were swimming. We were teaching those special needs adults, and that was just so valuable. That was really rewarding. And
well, you were the first one to get Ava's floaties off her, so I'll never forget that.
and then she's just away. She's a real swimmer.
I know. Oh, Robyn, thanks for talking with me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's good fun. Thanks.
We'll definitely talk again, because, as I said, we've just scratched the surface. There's a lot to chat about.
Okay, Nicole, that'd be good. Thank you. Okay, bye.